Hi, my name is Ken Sperduso, and I'd like to thank you for purchasing this series of videos on portrait painting. I'm excited to teach this to you. There's a lot of information I'd like to share. Some of it I've learned at Disney and through working with just great artists, great instructors, reading a lot of books. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to watch my series on portrait drawing. I really lay down a foundation of how to capture a likeness, how to look at light and shadow shapes, so that would be helpful. Something else that would be helpful to do is to look at any of Aaron Blaze's videos. He's done some very extensive videos on drawing the human form and painting the figure, as well as facial expressions. So any of those I think would be very helpful. In this series, we'll be talking about two basic approaches to portrait painting. The first being more of a master approach. The masters often painted in a grisaille first, and that's a monochrome underpainting. It's usually done in whites and grays. The idea was that they could tackle all of the drawing and the value relationships, the edges, and building the form apart from the complexity of color. So they would get all that done first. When that would dry, then they would overlay that underpainting with glazes and half pastes, which are semi-transparent layers of color. So that's what I'll be explaining to you and demonstrating. If you've ever seen a Rembrandt painting in person, you'll notice that it almost has its own light source. And that's because the light actually penetrates those layers of color. It hits the underpainting, which is filled with white and light grays, and then bounces back through. So it has this luminosity that you really can't achieve in any other way. So we'll talk about that technique first. Then we'll work through the alla prima approach. It's a more modern approach to painting. It's a little bit more spontaneous. You can get much more expressive brush strokes and more saturated color. The challenge there is it takes all of those different aspects of portrait painting, the drawing, the edges, the values, and the color, and you do it all at once. So I'll be explaining to you how to approach that. We'll be doing it over a simplified grisaille, and it's something that I find very satisfying. It's an approach that you can use like the other master approach, either digitally or in oil. So before we get started, I wanted to recommend a few books that you could read, which I think would be very helpful. The first is the Artist Handbook of Techniques and Materials. Now this book I got when I was in college. It was one that my instructors, Robert Sudlow and John Collier, insisted I get. This is an older copy. I'm sure you can find one that's newer, or you probably could find this at a flea market or at the library. But Ralph Mayer goes into great detail into the different techniques, the materials, how to mix paint, how to make your own paint. So it's great. It's a very helpful book. And we'll be talking about the same things. We'll be talking about the paints you can get, some safety issues to keep in mind, how to set up a palette. And this would be a great supplement to this class or any painting that you might do. We will also be covering some of the techniques that artists use, and I'll mention a number of artists, and that's what Max Dorner does. So he not only takes the techniques and the materials of the past, but he actually talks about how different artists might have used them, and this is very helpful. It's a less expensive book than the Ralph Mayer book, but it's definitely worthwhile getting. When it comes to our two approaches, the first being that master approach, I would really encourage you to pick up this book. It's by Solomon J. Solomon. It's The Practice of Oil Painting and Drawing. And in this book, he goes through the classical approach of drawing and painting. He studied at the Royal Academy in London and then studied over in France. So this is very helpful. He also has a series of images that are based on the paintings he describes as he walks through the National Gallery. So it's almost as if you're walking next to this master artist as he talks about these paintings he knows so well. And James Gurney does the introduction. James Gurney is a contemporary artist, excellent artist, and he does an excellent job of describing what's in this book. This is a republished version of the original. I have one of the original copies, really expensive, but this one is much more affordable. It's been republished by Dover, and you can get that book. Another book that Dover has recently republished is Harold Speed's Oil Painting Techniques and Materials. This is another great one. He was another English painter, and he goes into great depth into a different technique that you could use, a different approach, step-by-step approach. So this is very helpful and one that I'd recommend. When it comes to the alla prima approach to painting, this is one that I would recommend. It's by Richard Schmid. He was an American artist. He died recently, an excellent artist. He goes into great detail as to how to mix color, how to approach color, color temperature of light and shadow. We'll be talking about that as well. If you get a chance, you could check this out at the library. It's a bit more expensive than other art books, but it's well worth it. And I think it'd be a great supplement to this class and really any painting that you'd be doing. And then finally, since we'll be talking about anatomy and we'll be touching on expressions, I thought this book would be very helpful. Another one you probably could find at your library. And this is The Artist's Complete Guide to Facial Expressions by Gary Fagan. I use this in animation. It's great for illustration and visual development, and especially portrait painting. So he goes into basic anatomy of the face, and then he also breaks down what the facial features do when we have different moods and different expressions are communicated through our face. In the back, he has a breakdown of how the facial expressions actually affect the eyes and the mouth and the folds that those expressions create. So this is very helpful as well. Well, I thank you again for joining me on this course, and I look forward to teaching you. So let's get started. What I'd like to do first is introduce the materials that we'll be using. We'll talk about brushes and palette knives. We'll talk about the palette that you can use, and I have 3 different palettes to show you. And then we'll talk about care of your brushes. We'll also talk about how to use a medium, where to put the medium, how to clean your brushes while you're painting. And then we'll go over laying out a palette, and I'll explain the different types of colors that I use and the different types of paints that are available. There are actually 3 different kinds of brushes that have been used throughout history. The first is the round. So this is the brush that most of the masters would have used. And it's interesting because with a round brush, you can use the tip, of course, for detail, and these come in all different sizes. You can also use the side of the brush and pat it on the canvas, so you can create an interesting texture that way. So this is one that I would encourage you to get and experiment with. The next one is more of a flat shape. So these are flat brushes. One is a longer flat and then a shorter flat. And these give you chiseled marks. So with a brush like this, you can imagine someone like John Singer Sargent or Anthony Van Dyke doing beautiful long strokes. With a flat brush, you typically paint across the form in short, choppy strokes. So it's almost like carving, and it gives you a really chiseled effect. We use these on Brother Bear, and they were really enjoyable to use. It's a great brush to use for landscape painting. There is a third type of brush, and it's really a combination of the round and the flat. It's called a filbert. So you have the benefit of this round edge, but you still have the flat body of the brush. So it really works nicely for detail work. A lot of portrait painters will use a filbert. You can use it when you're actually sketching in, if you're drawing with a brush. And then you can use the flat side to put in a lot of different, a good amount of paint with a lot of different strokes. So this is a very versatile brush. So these are hog bristles. They're white, they're stiff. These are also, you can get them either in actual hog or synthetic. I tend to use synthetics, but the best part about them is that they're stiff enough that you can get a lot of paint on your brush. Another type of brush is the sable or the soft brush. And I would encourage you to experiment with these as well. So they come in round and flat and filberts. The nice part about the softer brush is that you get softer edges. You can get much more fluid brush strokes. You can blend with them. So these usually come after you've laid in the paint with the heavier brush. And this is what I'll be doing with the demonstrations. We'll usually start with that hog hair brush and then come in with these. Now these are synthetic. You can buy sable brushes. They're much more expensive and they don't last as long. So I tend to like these. These are Rosemary & Company. They're handmade in England. They're beautiful brushes and they're very sturdy. Another tool that you really want to have is called a palette knife. Now, palette knives come in multiple sizes. I just have 3, but they come in all different shapes and sizes as well. I typically use one that's more like a long spatula. I can mix paint easily. I can scrape down a canvas. You can also paint with a palette knife, so it's a great tool to have. When it comes to working with oil, like watercolor, you typically have to use something to mix with a paint to thin it so it goes on a little bit more evenly. So I use a number of mediums. The first would be walnut oil. Now, the Renaissance artists did not use solvents. They actually used walnut oil to clean their brushes, to mix their paints with. And it's nice because it's non-toxic. So you can use it at home. You don't have to worry about any of the fumes that you would get with a solvent. They also make a walnut alkyd medium, and whenever you see alkyd, it means that it's going to speed up the process of oil painting. One of the nice things about oil is that it's slow drying, but you can also speed that process up by using an alkyd medium. So I usually use both of those. I'll use the walnut oil mainly to clean my brushes, but also as a medium as well. You probably would want a small set of cups. These are palette cups that hold the medium, and then it clips on your palette. So it's very handy, and you can use it when you're landscape painting, and it usually has a screw on top, which is very, very helpful. For brush cleaning, you usually can use something like a brush cleaner that holds a little bit more. In this case, it has an area where you can set the brushes in, and so the brush cleaner actually comes above that level, and you can drop the brush in. You can use that screen on the bottom to scrub your brush, and then the paint actually falls to the base of this container. After a while, you can take this out and pour out the walnut oil, wipe out whatever you see down in the bottom. You'll have a little bit of the paint down at the bottom, and then you can just clean it and start over again. So this is a very handy brush cleaner. They come in smaller sizes for landscape painting. One thing you'll want to do after every painting session is to clean your brush. It's very important. So what I usually do is I'll use a combination of Murphy's Oil soap, which is a soap, it's a multi-purpose cleaner, and that will get most of the oil out. So it's a very great way of cleaning your brush, getting most of the paint that can get down into the bristles. And then I'll use something like a brush cleaner, a Master's brush cleaner, and I'll use that to actually condition the brush. So after I get most of the oil out, I can get the brush wet with cold water, and I can swirl it around here and get enough lather that it will clean the rest of the brush. I'll leave a little bit in there, and I can form the brush back into its original shape, let it dry. The next day, all I have to do is dip it in medium, and that soap will dissolve, and I have a brush that's clean and ready to go. So make sure that you clean your brushes after every use. One of the reasons why it's best to use a palette knife when mixing your color is that the more you use a brush to mix your paint, if you're using it to mix it on the palette, the more the paint tends to get into the base of the brush, and that's when the brush will splay. So it's okay to use your brush to mix small amounts of paint, but in general what I do is I will use the palette knife when I'm mixing a larger amount. That also helps when it comes to painting. If you're using paint in an impasto method, a thick method of painting, it's easier to mix more paint with a palette knife. So that's why I usually use this when I'm mixing color. When it comes to actually mixing the color and laying out your color, you want to have something called a palette, and there are a number of different options that you have that I would recommend. The first is a palette that is made of paper. It's a waxy paper, and it's something that you can dispose of when you're done. So I find it helpful to use a gray color. It also comes in white. I usually paint on a canvas that's gray or grayish green. So it helps to have a similar color on my palette, or at least a similar value or tone. So when I mix it here, I know what it'll look like up on the canvas. So this is a disposable canvas pad. There's also the traditional palette. This was handmade for me when I was in art school by a friend, and I'm left-handed, so this is a left-handed palette. It's made so that you can hold your brushes while painting, so I can grab paint here, paint it on the canvas, and then I can let my other hand hold it. So this is a traditional way of painting. It's very helpful if you're standing or painting large works. The other palette I would recommend you experiment with is a glass palette. So with this I have a cutting board. It's tempered glass so it won't break. I have a piece of paper that is about the color and tone of the tone of my canvas. Glass is great because it's very easy to mix on. I can spread out my colors. It's obviously an even surface, so the colors mix very well. And then it's very easy to clean up. You can take an X-Acto knife and just scrape off that glass and then wipe it down and it's clean. What I'd like to do next is actually lay out a palette using the colors that I typically use. Now, for years, I would study different palettes of the masters and more current painters. And then at Disney, we had an artist, his name is Len Schmiel, and he came and actually described his methods of landscape painting. What he did was he took a color wheel and he broke it and flattened it out so it would be stretched across the top of his palette. And then he used that palette in a way that made more sense than any other palette I'd ever tried. So that's what I've adopted since then. And it's really been very helpful and worked very well. So let me go ahead and lay that out for you so you can get an idea of how to set up a palette. I think the most important thing is that once you find something that works, that you continue to use it all the time. So after a while, you don't even have to think about reaching for those colors. You're just used to them on that palette. So let's start with white. My colors are mixed with walnut oil, and historically the Renaissance artists used walnut oil because it yellowed less than linseed oil. It's also a medium that they really can pack the pigment into, so these colors tend to be very vibrant and very buttery. So I've used them for many years and really love them. So the first color I would use is titanium white. Now titanium white is in a larger tube because I use so much of it. It's mixed with so many different mixtures during a portrait. So what I usually do is I'll start with titanium white somewhere down the left side of my palette. Titanium white, while it's a crucial color, it's a cold white. And when we're trying to capture a skin tone and we're trying to lighten that skin tone up, it actually is cooling down that color, which when you're trying to capture the warmth of a face, regardless of the tone or color of someone's face, it's actually going against what you're trying to do. You're trying to capture that warmth. Titanium white cools it down. So in that case, you can use something called warm white. It's unbleached titanium. So it's still titanium white, but it's a different process where it's unbleached and it's more of a yellow gray, which really is wonderful for mixing flesh tones. So that's something that I'll add to my palette as an option when mixing something that needs to stay warm. If you don't get warm white, you usually can mix your own. You can try a little yellow ochre with your titanium white just to keep that warmth in the color as you're mixing. I also use something called flake white replacement, which is a very thick white. It has the consistency of flake or lead white. Now you have to be careful with actual flake and lead white because of the toxicity. So that's why I don't usually use lead white anymore. I used to when I was in school. It has a wonderful feel, but you do have to be extremely careful with lead white. You don't want to get it into any cuts on your hands. You don't want to ingest it. It really can make you quite ill. So that's why I've started using something called flake white replacement, which gives a similar feel to the old lead white. So it will show your brush strokes much more than, say, titanium white will. When choosing your colors, you can find really two different types of oil paints. There's the student grade, and if you're just starting out, that can be a wonderful way of getting the colors you need to practice. But at some point, you want to invest in a higher quality of paint. So there are many very good paint manufacturers that create some really beautiful paints. I've settled on M. Graham, which is a handmade paint using walnut oil. I've also used Winsor Newton. There are other paints that you can use, that Old Holland, that use an ancient recipe for their colors. So I think the best thing is actually to experiment with different manufacturers, because they all have a little bit of a different feel. They have a different philosophy with their color mixing. I personally love M. Graham for their colors, for the way they feel when I mix them, but I would definitely try and experimenting with different colors. Now with that palette that I learned while at Disney, the idea is to have warm and cool versions of your main primary colors and a few other colors that you use quite often. So not only do you have a hue, and that would be in this case the color family, it would be yellow. You have chroma, which means it could be very saturated or less saturated. You have the value, that's how dark or light it is. And then it's temperature. So in this case, this is a cool yellow. And you'll notice right away that when I put it down, it has more of a greenish yellow feel to it. So it's still yellow, and yellow is a warm color, but it's actually cooler than this next yellow, which is cadmium yellow deep. It has more red in it, so it's warmer. So in this case, I have two different colors representing yellow. One is cool, one is warm, so I can use those with different flesh tones, different color temperatures of light. And so it's very handy to have both the warm and the cool version. After a while, you'll get to know these colors and their personalities. So cadmium yellow light or cadmium yellow pale is an extremely strong color. It wants to take over any mixture. Cadmium yellow deep is a little bit more polite, and it's something that you can use to tint, and it's not as strong. Now with cadmium colors, they're typically opaque. That means that when you use them on the canvas, it's going to cover up the canvas. They're not going to be transparent at all. They're nice and thick. They're great for flesh tones. And I'll talk in a minute about other colors that are more transparent that you can use for glazes. The next color I usually use is yellow ochre. Now this is one that I can actually mix myself using other colors on my palette, but it's just a color that I've grown to love over the years. Now yellow ochre is interesting because it can change from paint manufacturer to paint manufacturer. So this yellow is a nice, deep, rich earth yellow. Some manufacturers create a yellow ochre which is much darker, some much lighter. But it's a great color. It's opaque. It's wonderful for mixing with other colors, with a purple or a blue to mix a nice green. So it's definitely one that I would recommend on your palette. The next one is Van Dyke Brown. Now, typically the masters would use a color called ivory black, and they would use that to tint their colors and to get those really rich darks. The downside of ivory black is it can really deaden a color. So what I recommend is something like Van Dyke Brown. It's actually a warm black, and it's one that you can use for tinting. It's semi-transparent, so that it's great for glazing. And I learned this while at Disney, that you can use this Van Dyke Brown to deepen the color, to darken the color, but it's not going to deaden the color like ivory black. So that's a color I would recommend. The next is transparent red iron oxide. This is a beautiful color. It's very much like burnt sienna. So it's a warm reddish mahogany brown. This has a little bit less yellow, and it's a little bit less grainy than burnt sienna. So it's a wonderful color for skin tones. You can mix your own rich blacks with this, mixed with a blue. It's really a wonderful color. So now we're heading into the reds. So we have the cool and warm version of our yellow, and then we have yellow ochre, which is part of the yellow family, the Van Dyke Brown, which is also part of that hue, a much darker version, and with transparent red iron oxide, now we're moving into the reds. And this is cadmium red light. It's a warm red. It's a cadmium color, so it's opaque. It's wonderful for skin tones. It's warmer and obviously lighter than straight cadmium. There's also cadmium red deep, which is a very dark, rich color that you also can have on your palette. So that's my warm red. For a cool red, I would suggest either alizarin crimson or something called anthraquinone red. So this is a permanent version of alizarin crimson. Alizarin crimson is a wonderful color. It's transparent, it's rich, it's very strong, but it's not light fast. So if you use it in big areas on your painting, over time it will fade. So M. Graham has come up with a permanent version of this. So it's the same basic color and has the same properties, but it won't fade. So it's definitely a wonderful color to have. This is more transparent, and this is a very strong color, so you can use it in very small amounts. So as I'm laying out these colors, I usually start on the left side and go across, and then usually down the right side. So these colors actually are almost circling around the area where I'll mix the paint. And sometimes if I have a larger palette, I can fit them all across the top. If it's a smaller palette, I might even have to start lower. But this is a way of actually organizing the palette so I can easily reach these colors. So at this point I have yellows, I have my reds, I have actually 3 different versions of red. And now I use dioxazine purple. This is an extremely strong color. It's great for mixing rich darks. I can mix it in with yellows because purple is the complement of yellow, meaning it exists across on the color wheel, directly across. And when you mix complements together, you actually gray the color down. So if I want to take, say, a cadmium yellow light, which is extremely strong, and if I want to deaden that color slightly, I can use a little bit of purple, and that will gray it down. So dioxazine purple is an excellent color. My next color is ultramarine blue. It's an all-purpose blue that's actually a warm blue because it has red in it. So it's actually closer to my reds on the palette because it shares that red color. So this is a nice color for everything from cooling shadows down to capturing the color of water, sky. It's really an excellent color. And if you have a limited palette, meaning you're taking this bigger palette and just taking a few colors, if you go out landscape painting, ultramarine blue is definitely one you want to take with you. So my next color is cobalt blue. Now this is an expensive blue. You can get something called cobalt hue. So if you're getting a student grade, if you see hue after the color, it means that it's not actually made of cobalt or it's not actually made of cadmium, but it's meant to be close to it in color. So it's a less expensive way of getting a nice color. But I usually use cobalt blue. It's a wonderful blue. It's a cold blue, and you'll see how different it looks on the palette. So you have less red, probably a little bit more green, and you can see just the difference between these two blues. A much warmer blue, since it has red in it, and then this cooler blue. So this is great for sky colors, when you're working with reflected light in faces, or if you're painting a landscape in grass. It's really a wonderful, wonderful blue to use. Now, cobalt is a heavy metal, and it's also something that's toxic. Along with that, cadmium colors are toxic as well. So if you get the hue version or the student version, you won't have that toxicity. It's not as strong a color. It doesn't have the same feel, but keep that in mind. We'll talk in a minute about how you can protect yourself even with these stronger colors that might have a toxic element. All right, so we have our yellows, we have our reds, we have the warm and cool version of the blue, and now we're moving into the greens. Now, greens actually you can mix with your blues and yellows, but I really enjoy having 2 greens on my palette. Let me put this other one on first. This is actually Viridian. This is a cooler green. It's a beautiful color. It's transparent. It's not as strong as something called phthalo green. It's a very quiet green that you can use for tinting. You'll notice right away how cool that is. So this is really nice for cool passages in skin tones, in men where the beard gets a little bit cooler. If you're painting outdoors, if you have cool shadows. It's wonderful for grass. In fact, there was an early 20th century, late 19th century painting school in England where you actually could pick out their paintings because they have this beautiful cool green, this Viridian. So the last color I'm going to put down on my palette is sap green. Now this is a much warmer green. It has much more yellow in it. This is permanent. Again, sap green can have the same issues that alizarin crimson can have, where over time, since most sap green is not light fast, it will fade. But whenever you see permanent, that means it's safe to use and you don't have to worry about that color fading. All right, so now I have my palette laid out. It's laid out so I can reach for the colors. I can use my palette knife to scoop those colors and then mix in this area. So the way my colors are laid out, I can move in either direction to either warm or cool the color. So let's say I'm starting with this cooler red and I want to warm it up. I can just add a little bit of the cadmium red light, which is a warmer color, and that will warm this red up. If I want to cool it down, I can take one step to the right and use a little bit of my dioxazine purple, and that will cool it down. So you can see how if this was continued around in a big circle, this is basically a color wheel that's now flattened out, and I can move in either direction if I want to warm colors up or cool them down. Also, the colors tend to go from more opaque to a little bit more transparent. The exceptions would be Van Dyke Brown and the transparent red iron oxide on this end of the palette. The others are quite opaque, as are the whites. If you need a white that needs to be more transparent, zinc white is a good one to get. So it's not as heavy as the whites that I have on my palette. So like I said before, once you find a good system, I would stick with that and constantly go back to laying out your palette in the same way. So then it becomes instinctive when you want to reach for a color. This is more of a full palette. Now there are actually palettes that are even more extensive, maybe twice as many colors. So this is probably a medium-sized palette. There's also something called a limited palette where you can choose colors that you want to take with you, whether you're doing, say, a portrait painting in the style of Anders Zorn, who was a Swedish painter who used really just a yellow, a red, a black, and a white, and that was it. And he could mix all the colors he needed just with those few colors. So the nice part about this palette is I can choose a color from each of these families to take with me if I'm going landscape painting. So I don't necessarily need this entire group. And after a while, you get used to mixing these colors so that it's much easier to know which colors to take with you. So when it comes to mixing color, I'd encourage you to watch Ronnie Williford's series on color theory. That will really help you understand just the basics of color and how you can mix color, whether it's in watercolor or oil. And really, as an artist, that's one of the most important aspects of color to understand is how they work together, the colors that are available, and how you can actually use these to express yourself in a way that captures what you see. Now, when we're talking about using cobalts or cadmiums, there's a number of ways you can protect yourself. One is called a barrier cream. So I use ArtGuard. It's made by Winsor Newton. It's a cream that you can just put on your hands, and it really does act as a barrier. So if I get cobalt blue in my hands, I can wash it off much more easily if I have this barrier cream. And there are many different brands. I like this one. It's non-greasy and it works well. The other option is to actually wear gloves, and a lot of painters wear gloves. I tend not to because I don't have the same feel, and I honestly tend to be a bit sloppier when I have gloves on, and I'm not as conscientious, so it tends to get everywhere and I can't feel if I've gotten something on my hands. But you may want to try that because that will help keep the paints off your hands. When it comes to actually washing up, I would do it outside. If you have a hose, you could do it outside, or a utility sink. Definitely don't do this in the kitchen. You want to keep this away from young children or animals. For the most part, this is non-toxic as far as the materials go, but you definitely don't want little children or animals to get into this because that can make them sick. The last thing I want to show you when we're talking about color is how you can mix color charts. So this is something I learned from an artist named Richard Schmid. There's a great book called Alla Prima, where he takes his palette and he will mix one board with each of the colors along the top of his palette, and then he'll add white in 5 different values. So you have on top, you have the color straight from the tube, and then he'll mix white to come up with tints down the board. So what he will do is he would start with one board with all of his colors, and then he would mix white in 4 steps, creating tints. And then he would pick one color. So let's say it's cadmium yellow pale, and he would mix that with every other color on his palette, and then add white to create even more tints. And what that does is it gives you so many colors that you could choose from. You can see, beautiful flesh tones or tones you could use for flowers or clothing, and some really interesting colors that you may never have thought would be possible until you did the color charts. So this is another one with cadmium yellow deep, and you can see just the variety of color you can get from this one color, cadmium yellow deep, mixed with the other colors in the palette, and just how different that is from a cooler yellow. So it's a great exercise. It takes some time, but it's definitely worth the effort. And then this one is with cadmium red, for instance, and you can see this is a little bit darker and cooler than cadmium yellow light, but again, it's mixed with all the other colors on the palette and then mixed with white to create those tints. So I would really encourage you to do this with whatever palette you decide to use. You can actually use a stencil, which I did. I stenciled these out and taped this off, and then I actually used a palette knife, which also gave me practice in mixing with a palette knife and then putting the paint on a board, so that it made it much easier when I wanted to paint with a palette knife. Let's begin our painting with a sketch of the skull. Now, it's very important when you approach portrait painting to understand the underlying anatomy of the face, and the human skull really makes its presence felt in the face. So it's really important to do a lot of sketches of the skull, to study the anatomy. I would encourage you to watch Aaron Blaze's videos on human anatomy. He really does a great job of describing the bones of the face as well as the rest of the body, and that's very important for portrait painting. And we'll touch on that. What I'm going to do actually is begin this painting, we'll finish it, and then I'll describe the bones that I've painted. I'm also going to use a historic technique. It's called the grisaille technique. It's based on the idea of breaking up the process into 2 steps. So I have this study I did of a Sir Thomas Lawrence painting, and an artist like Sir Thomas Lawrence would have overlaid the color on an underpainting. So this is a separate painting that I did. It's the underpainting version. So if you go to a museum and see, say, a Rembrandt painting, you're actually looking at 2 paintings in one. He would initially do a painting in grisaille, which just means a monochrome with grays and whites and browns. And then on top of that, he would overlay the color. So I'm going to show you how to do that with this skull sketch. We'll start with Van Dyke brown and white. You can also use raw umber. That's also a nice color to use. And what we'll do is we'll basically capture the form, the edges, the drawing, and then once it dries, we'll be able to put the color on top, and we'll be using glazes and half pastes, which are semi-transparent layers of color, and then that underpainting shines through and it gives you a lot of luminosity. If you've seen a Rembrandt in person, you'll notice that there's a great deal of luminosity in his paintings. It's because you see this underpainting affecting the top color. It's actually the light's penetrating, hitting that bright underpainting and bouncing back through. So it's a very luminous quality that he gets in his paintings. All right, so as far as setup goes, I'm left-handed, so I'm going to have my easel on the left side and the subject to the right. That way I'm not looking over my arm. I'm also set up so that I can lock my head and just move my eyes back and forth. So you have to remember that any painting you do is memory painting. So if I'm going to be painting the skull, I'm going to be looking at shapes, and then I'll have to capture that shape in my mind and then look over here and remember what that shape is. If I have my subject too far away, then when I shift my attention, I'm looking at all of these other distracting shapes, and it's much more difficult to retain that shape. So that's why it's good to have your canvas and the subject as close as possible, and you can do that with portrait painting as well. The other benefit is that I can pick out an area and just flash my eye back and forth. So let's say I'm painting this angle of the zygomatic bone, which is the strong cheekbone that you can feel right under the surface. If I get that angle incorrect, let's say I draw that angle here and flash my eye back and forth, I can actually see it move on the canvas, and that means that it's not in the right place. If I flash my eye back and forth and the angle matches perfectly, then I know I've drawn it accurately. It's a little bit like what animators used to do, where they would feed the paper into their fingers and they would roll the paper and they would look for errors in volume or something that jumped that wasn't quite smooth in the movement of this character. And it's similar when you're just flashing your eye back and forth. So give that a try. Try to set up your easel in such a way that you can see your subject without moving your head. The other issue too is to sit back away from your canvas. So one artist I worked with said you fence with your canvas. You try to hold the brush at the very end and then lock your elbow. So you're using as much of your arm as possible. If you're standing, you can really push back from the canvas. It's also a good idea to make sure that you have space clear behind you so that you can see your painting from afar, because people are actually going to look at a painting from a greater distance than we paint it. So you want to make sure that you're painting in such a way that you're seeing the big shapes. Eventually I can get a maul stick, which is a stick I can lean or rest my hand on, and that will help me with getting those smaller shapes. But initially I want to sit back as far as possible. You'll notice that I have a tone on my canvas, and it's a gray tone, it's a neutral tone. It helps when I put color on the canvas. So if you start with a bare white canvas, anything you put on here is going to be darker than that surface. So by toning it, it's almost like middle C in a keyboard. It's a way of starting at a midpoint, and so it's much easier to gauge my values. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to a glass palette, I can try to match that color, so when I'm mixing here, I know what it will look like up there. Another consideration is the type of surface you use. Now I've just pinned this canvas to a board. You can paint on canvas that's actually glued to a board, so it has a pretty stiff surface. You can also have stretched canvas, which gives a little bit of play to the canvas. So as you press on that canvas, it's going to have a little bit of give, and it's going to make your brush strokes a little bit softer. So I would try to experiment with both a solid surface and stretched canvas and see which one you like best. Another important thing to remember when you're painting over time, it's easy to overlook any errors that might creep in. So something else I try to keep in mind when I set up is I want to be able to take a small mirror and turn away from the subject and hold the mirror in such a way that I can see both the subject and my canvas at the same time. What that does is it gives you a fresh eye on your painting. So it's almost like house blindness. It's actually a real thing that if you have a messy house, after a while you no longer see the mess until you go away on a trip and come back, and then you're horrified at the mess. Well, it's the same with a mirror. You get used to seeing these errors in your drawing. When you look at it backwards, it's like coming back from vacation and you see all of these errors in proportion and placement. So try a mirror, try setting up so you can see both the subject and the canvas at the same time, and that will help you with your accuracy. Last consideration when it comes to canvas is the amount of texture it has. Now, student grade texture typically is very pebbly, and it has a very sandpaper-like quality. Now that's good if you want the brushstrokes to splay or to break apart. I use a smoother canvas. This is Clausen's, it's Belgian linen. It's a portrait grade, and it's very smooth. There's a little bit of texture, but it's really nice as far as laying down the brushstrokes. So again, I would experiment with different textures and see which one you like best. Now we are going to start with grays. I'm going to lay out just a little bit of Van Dyke Brown on my palette. The idea is that I'm going to block this in first just using Van Dyke Brown, using it to draw with, and then I'll start mixing white, and I'll basically create that dimension using just two colors, white and Van Dyke Brown. It's a great practice to paint in monochrome, not only to do this type of technique where you will lay color on top, but it's also great just as a practice where you're looking at value. So we're just seeing the lights and the darks, because that's one of the most important aspects of mixing color. It's seeing things in value. So these are studies that I've done. These are from a Planes of the Head cast. It's very helpful in seeing the tones, the relationships between lights and darks. You can practice with your edges, and it's all done without the complexity of color. So this is a still life I did with just raw umber and white. So again, it's an excellent way of practicing seeing your values, working with your edges, and then worrying about color at another stage. So I would encourage you to do that. And lastly, this is a study I did of a Van Dyke painting, and he would have also used this technique where he would have blocked things in with a grisaille, a monochrome underpainting, and then placed color on top. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to get a little bit of medium on my brush just to make it moist enough that when I pick up some color, it mixes a little bit easier. And then I can dry it off on a paper towel. You can do a couple of test strokes. This will all be painted over. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to sit back and I'm going to look for really big shapes. So I'm just going to very lightly come in and try to capture the envelope or the overall shape that contains this skull. So as a medium, I'm using that walnut oil and walnut oil alkyd. So that's going to help thin the paint. And now I'm just going in and trying to get big shapes. And I'm keeping it loose. I'm just trying to get a feel for the overall shapes and the size, the scale. The nice part about starting this way is, let's say I make an error. I can just take another brush and I can actually just rub over it. I can get a little bit of walnut oil on my brush and actually just go in and erase that mark. So it's really an easy way of progressing through this drawing. Since all of this is going to be painted over, I don't have to worry so much about errors. Once I get this basic shape blocked in, and I can even suggest where that plane is that it's sitting on. Now what I usually do is I'll hone in on one shape. And in this case, I'm probably going to go for the intersection from where I'm looking with the nasal bone and one of the eye sockets, or the orbit. So now I can go back in, get a little bit more Van Dyke Brown on my brush, and I can begin just to stare at those shapes and try to get those shapes accurate. And I'll try to keep this fairly light. I don't have to go very dark at this point, and I can just go with straight lines. It's easier to paint over straight lines. Now, as I mentioned in my video on drawing portraits, the key to capturing a likeness of anything that you're working on is really focusing on shapes. And so I would encourage you to go back and watch that. There are some helpful hints as to how to study and observe those shapes so that you can capture them with accuracy. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for big shadow shapes that are easy to grab a hold of. And right now I'm drawing the orbit, and I can just block in these shapes, thinking in terms of the angles. I can also think of a clock face. So if I'm trying to capture an angle like this, I can actually picture a clock face. So if that's 12, this might be 4 o'clock. So I'm thinking in terms of those angles, which can make this a little bit more of an accurate drawing. So now I can just shift over to the next shape, and I can just carve this in. All right, so I'll finish up here with my larger brush and get some of these bigger shapes knocked in, some of these lighter values blocked in. And next I'll come in with a bit of a smaller brush and just make sure that the shapes that I'm putting in are accurate in terms of their size and placement on the canvas. I can use those softer brushes that I mentioned earlier, since I'm getting into more of refining the shapes, making sure that I'm capturing those softer shapes. Okay, so at this point, what I'll do is I'll sit back and look at the shapes, make sure that they're accurate. I'll compare the shadow shapes with what I see in the skull. I'll compare the values, making sure that I'm starting to get close with the lightest light and darkest dark, although I want to keep my darks fairly light, and it looks like I can lighten those up a little bit more just so I keep the luminosity of the skull. I still have plenty of room to go as far as lighter values, so I'm gradually working up to the lights. I can also block in more of the background, so that'll be my next job, and use the same technique. I can go in with a middle tone and paint back in so we can get some nice soft edges. And then when it comes to areas like the teeth or some of these smaller ridges around the mandibula or the orbit of the eye along the zygomatic bone, that's when I'll probably take a smaller brush, one that's a sable, could be a round, and go in and just make sure that I'm carving in those shapes and so that they're reading accurately, even though I'm going to try to use some very loose and painterly brush strokes as well. Once all that dries, then we can go in and we can start layering color on top so I can get something of the tone of both the skull, the wall, and that fabric that it's sitting on. So I'm pulling this in here, and now I'm just about ready to go in and just strengthen those highlights, and then we should be done. This is a small study. If it was an extensive painting and I had a lot of different colors, yes, I would go in and glaze and paint back in. But one of the reasons why I chose this, not only just to go over anatomy, was just so you could see a simple version, so it's a little bit easier to understand how this works. All right, so I'm going to grab another one of my softer brushes. This is a Rosemary & Company #1. It's a Shiraz, so again, it's a very soft brush, and it's a filbert. I'm going to go back in and mix some of those highlights, but this time I'm actually going to use opaque paint. So I still will use a little bit of medium, and I'm going to go back to some of the colors I've already mixed. And sit back, and I'm going to see where I can add that color. So I can add just a little bit of color back in. And this is actually opaque paint, so I'm painting right back into the color I've laid down. And I'm just picking out those areas where I want to re-emphasize the lights. And I've done a lot of reading on it, and this is apparently how many of the masters would work. They would go back and forth between adding glazes and then painting back in with opaque paint. And you can continue that process. When this dries, I could glaze over it again and then add more opaque paint back into it. And I still can be spontaneous and have strong brush strokes even even in these areas where I'm adding thicker paint. And I can also re-emphasize some of the form, so I can paint back into that glaze and capture something more of the form that I see. All right, last thing I'm going to do, and then I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm just going to try to capture some of the value changes in the teeth. All right, and like before, I'm going to sit back and take a look from afar and see if there's anything that I need to add or want to add at this point. And I think I'm going to leave it at this. So you can take this process as far as you want. I could, once this dries, like I said before, I can add more color. I can go back in and pick out shapes. I can emphasize the thick paint as well as the glazes. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can use this old master technique to create something that really captures form and light and luminosity. I'm just going to reach for one of my other badger hair brushes and just blend a little bit. Calm down those areas a little bit, those areas that are catching the light. All right. Yeah, so like I said, I'm going to leave it at that. I could always come back and revisit any areas that need to be pulled out even more and using opaque paint. So let's review. We started out with that underpainting called the grisaille. We painted with Van Dyke Brown and titanium white. We also used flake white replacement to capture something of the heavier brush strokes that the masters would have used. I painted in monochrome. So remember, we weren't worried about color. We were just thinking in terms of big light and shadow shapes, trying to get the drawing nailed down, trying to get the edges nailed down so we can have our sharpest edges and our softest edges. And then once that dried, I put a transparent glaze over of my walnut alkyd just to moisten the canvas a little bit. And then I just started creating these thin glazes. Remember, the glazes are just transparent layers of color, so the light will penetrate and then bounce off, come back through. So I'm trying to capture that luminosity and that inner light. So once I put in those big glazes, then I could go back with half pastes. Remember, those are the half transparent, half opaque layers of color. I can add those in, and then I can also add transparent or opaque. I can also add opaque color back in and hit those highlights as well. So next time you're at a museum or you're looking at a master painting, remember that those paintings were done in two steps. They had the underpainting and then the color on top. And together it created some beautiful effects. All right, so we're going to move on and we'll get into our alla prima approach where we will actually add color. We'll be adding color to the underpainting in a different way. Mainly opaque paint, so we're not going to be using this glazing technique.